Welcome, friends! Today we have a wonderful new story. A prince falls in love with an orphan girl. Before we begin, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to our channel and like the video so we can continue posting new episodes daily. Thank you and enjoy! The rain over the kingdom of Oakhaven never simply fell, it wept. It cascaded down the towering spires of the white marble palace, washing over the gilded statues of long-dead conquerors, and pooled in the muddy, unforgiving streets of the lower city. High above the squalor, wrapped in the suffocating luxury of the royal estate, Prince Kaelin stood by the towering glass windows of his bedchamber. The glass was thick, designed to keep the cold out and the warmth in, but Kaelin felt a chill that no hearth could banish. He was the sole heir to a dynasty forged in blood and sustained by ruthless ambition. His life had been meticulously charted before he had even drawn his first breath. Every word he spoke, every garment he wore, and every smile he offered was carefully curated by a council of advisors who saw him not as a man, but as a vessel for the crown. He was a prisoner in a cage of unimaginable wealth, his soul slowly starving amidst a feast of opulence. Seeking refuge from the endless drone of political emissaries and the watchful, hawkish eyes of his father, King Valerius, Kaelin frequently escaped to the only sanctuary left to him, the forgotten eastern wing of the royal archives. It was a labyrinthine repository of ancient texts, crumbling maps, and forgotten histories, long abandoned by the court, who favored the vibrant, gossipy halls of the grand ballroom. The air here was thick with the scent of decaying vellum, dried ink, and undisturbed dust. It was in this sepia-toned world of silence that Kaelin first saw her. Her name was Lyra. She was not a lady of the court, nor the daughter of a visiting dignitary. She was an orphan, a child of the weeping streets below, brought into the palace solely because her small, nimble fingers possessed a rare, miraculous talent for restoring manuscripts. She sat at a heavy oak table, bathed in the singular golden beam of afternoon light that managed to pierce through the high, arched windows. She wore a simple, faded gray dress made of rough-spun wool, a stark contrast to the silks and velvets that Kaelin was accustomed to. Her dark hair was tied back carelessly, a few stray strands framing a face that was pale, sharp, and profoundly beautiful in its raw, unadorned state. She was hunched over a crumbling tome, her hands moving with a delicate, reverent precision. Kaelin stepped out of the shadows, the heels of his leather boots clicking softly against the stone floor. Lyra did not flinch, nor did she immediately look up. When she finally did, her eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, met his without a hint of the subservience he was so used to receiving. There was no deep curtsy, no trembling avert of the gaze. She merely looked at him, recognizing the golden crest of the royal house embroidered on his doublet, and then slowly, almost reluctantly, placed her binding needle down. "My lord," she said, her voice soft but steady, carrying a faint rasp that spoke of cold winters and harsh living. "You do not tremble," Kaelin noted, stepping closer, genuinely intrigued. "Most of the servants do when they find themselves alone with the prince." Lyra offered a faint, fleeting smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Trembling makes it rather difficult to thread a needle, Your Highness, and these pages have survived 3 centuries of neglect. They do not deserve to be ruined by my nerves." It was a simple, pragmatic answer, yet it struck Kaelin with the force of a physical blow. It lacked the sugary flattery of the court. It was honest. From that afternoon onward, the Eastern Archives became the center of Kaelin's universe. He began to visit her every day. At first, he would simply sit in an armchair across the room, reading while she worked. But the silence between them was a living, breathing thing. rich with unspoken curiosity. Slowly, the silence gave way to tentative conversation. They spoke of the books she was restoring, of the histories of forgotten things, and eventually of themselves. Lyra told him of the orphanage in the lower city, a place of damp walls and perpetually empty stomachs. She spoke of the harsh realities of survival, of learning to find beauty in the discarded and the broken. She spoke without pitying herself, her words laced with a quiet, steely resilience that Kaylin found mesmerizing. In return, Kaylin stripped away the armor of his royalty. He confessed his suffocating fears, the crushing weight of his father's expectations, and his desperate yearning for a life where he could simply be a man, rather than a symbol. As the weeks bled into months, the damp chill of the archives was replaced by a blossoming, radiant warmth. Kaylin found himself captivated not just by Lyra's resilience, but by the gentle grace with which she navigated the world. He memorized the way she chewed her bottom lip when she was concentrating, the way her laughter, rare but musical, echoed in the vast room, and the way her rough, calloused fingers felt when they accidentally brushed against his while passing a book. It was during one of these fleeting touches that Kaylin finally realized the terrifying, exhilarating truth. He was entirely, irrevocably in love with her. He kissed her for the first time amidst a thunderstorm, the rain lashing fiercely against the high windows of the library. He had been reading to her, the words trailing off as he looked up to find her already watching him, her storm-colored eyes wide and vulnerable. He crossed the distance between them, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. When his lips met hers, it was a collision of two entirely different worlds. It was a kiss born of desperate longing, tasting of old parchment and the electric ozone of the storm. Lyra kissed him back with a fierce, trembling intensity, her hands clutching the fabric of his tunic, as if he were the only solid thing in a crumbling universe. But their sanctuary was an illusion, a fragile bubble floating in a sea of razor-sharp reality. The world outside the archives was not blind, and the whispers of the court were a venomous tide that eventually reached the throne room. King Valerius was a man carved from granite, a ruler who believed that love was a weakness and marriage was merely a transaction of power. When he summoned Kaylin to his private solar, the air in the room was as heavy as lead. "You are to marry Princess Genevieve of the Northern Reach," the king announced, not looking up from the maps spread across his massive desk. "The treaties have been signed. The wedding will take place before the winter solstice." Kaylin felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to tilt beneath his feet. "Father, no, I cannot." The king finally looked up, his eyes cold and devoid of any paternal warmth. "You are not a peasant to speak of what you can and cannot do. You are the crown prince. You will do what is required for the realm." "I do not love her," Kaylin pleaded, his voice thick with a desperate, rising panic. "I love someone else." King Valerius stood up, his imposing figure casting a long, dark shadow over the room. "The bookbinder," he spat, the words dripping with absolute disdain. "A rat from the gutters of the lower city. Did you truly think your little dalliances in the dusty corners of my palace would go unnoticed? You are a fool, Kaylin, a sentimental fool." "She is worth more than every sycophant in this court combined," Kaylin shouted, abandoning all protocol, his fists clenched at his sides. "She is nothing," the king roared back, his voice echoing like thunder. "She is a footnote, an aberration, and if you do not end this pathetic infatuation by nightfall, I will ensure she is removed from this city. And the world outside these walls, my son, is exceptionally cruel to pretty, unprotected orphans. Do I make myself clear?" The threat hung in the air, a poison blade pressed directly against Kaylin's throat. He was trapped. To rebel meant to endanger the very woman he loved. To submit meant to lose his soul entirely. Word of the king's decree spread through the palace like wildfire. By the time Kaelin managed to break away from the watchful eyes of his father's guards and sprint toward the eastern archives, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks of red across the sky. He burst through the heavy oak doors, his chest heaving, his eyes frantically scanning the room. The archives were empty. Lyra's work table was cleared. The tools she treated with such reverence were gone. Only a single, perfectly restored book lay in the center of the table, and atop it, a small silver pen that Kaelin had given her weeks ago. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He knew her. He knew the deep-seated survival instincts of an orphan who had learned early in life that to wait for abandonment was to invite destruction. She was running. She was leaving to protect him and to protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak. Kaelin did not care about the guards, the crown, or the furious wrath of his father. He sprinted through the palace corridors, ignoring the shocked gasps of the courtiers. He burst out of the palace gates just as a torrential downpour began, the sky weeping once more over Oakhaven. He ran down the winding, treacherous path that led to the lower city, the mud splashing against his royal garments, staining the silk and soaking him to the bone. The lower city was a maze of dark alleys and dilapidated buildings, but Kaelin let his instincts guide him, heading toward the western gates that led out of the kingdom. The rain was blinding, a curtain of gray water that washed away the colors of the world. And then he saw her. She was a small, fragile figure walking against the howling wind, a meager canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "Lyra!" Kaelin screamed, his voice tearing from his throat, barely piercing the roar of the tempest. She stopped, her shoulders stiffening, but she did not turn around. Kaelin closed the distance between them, grabbing her arm and spinning her to face him. Her face was drenched, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks, but he could tell that the water streaming down her face was not just rain. She was crying, her storm-colored eyes shattered with a profound, agonizing grief. "Let me go, Kaelin," she sobbed, trying to wrench her arm from his grasp. "Please, let me go." "No," he gasped, pulling her closer, wrapping his arms around her trembling frame. "I will never let you go." "Why did you run?" "Because I have to," she cried out, her voice breaking, the defensive walls she had built her entire life finally collapsing. "Because you are a prince, and I am nothing. I have nothing to offer you but ruin. Your father will destroy you. He will destroy us. I am an orphan, Kaelin. I am used to leaving before I am left. I cannot survive watching you marry someone else. I would rather disappear." Kaelin took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the mixture of rain and tears. He looked into her eyes, letting her see the absolute, unyielding certainty in his soul. "You are not nothing," he said, his voice dropping to a fierce, fervent whisper. "You are my entire world. I do not want the crown if it means I cannot have you. I do not want the throne, the wealth, or the power. It is all ash and dust without you. You cannot abandon your duty," she whispered, her hands resting against his chest, feeling the frantic, desperate beating of his heart. "My duty is to my own soul," Kaelin replied fiercely, "and my soul belongs to you." He kissed her then, right there in the mud and the pouring rain, surrounded by the decay of the lower city. It was a vow spoken without words, a sealing of their fates. When they finally broke apart, Kaelin took her hand, his grip tight and unyielding. He did not lead her out of the city gates. Instead, he turned back toward the towering monolith of the palace on the hill. They walked back together, their clothes soaked and ruined, hand in hand. When they passed through the grand palace doors, leaving a trail of mud and rainwater on the pristine marble floors, the court fell into a stunned, breathless silence. King Valerius emerged from the crowd, his face purple with rage, his guards stepping forward with hands on their hilts. "What is the meaning of this?" the king demanded, his voice echoing ominously in the vast hall. "You dare bring this gutter trash back into my halls? Guards, seize her." Kalen stepped in front of Lyra, shielding her with his body, his eyes blazing with a fire that made even the seasoned guards hesitate. "If any man touches her, he will answer to my blade," Kalen declared, his voice ringing with a newfound, terrifying authority. He looked directly at his father, standing tall, no longer the subservient son, but a man who had finally claimed his own destiny. "I am your heir, father," Kalen said, his voice steady and echoing with absolute conviction. "But I will not be your puppet. I refuse the marriage to Princess Genevieve. If you wish to disinherit me, do it. Strip me of my titles, cast me out, let my name be forgotten. But I will not leave this palace without Lyra. She is my choice. She is my equal. And if I am to be king one day, she will be my queen." The silence that followed was deafening. The king stared at his son, seeing for the first time the unbreakable iron in Kalen's spine. Valerius looked at the ragged, soaking wet girl standing behind the prince, her chin raised in quiet, dignified defiance, despite her fear. For a long, agonizing moment, the fate of the kingdom hung suspended in the heavy air. The king's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, but he recognized the dangerous edge in his son's posture. To push Kalen now would mean losing his only heir, plunging the kingdom into chaos and civil war. Slowly, with a heavy, begrudging sigh that seemed to age him 10 years, King Valerius raised a hand, signaling the guards to stand down. He turned his back on them, his cape sweeping violently behind him. "Clean yourselves up," the king muttered darkly over his shoulder. "You are making a mess of my floors." It was not an outright blessing, nor was it a warm acceptance, but it was a surrender. It was the crack in the stone wall through which the light could finally pour in. Kalen turned to Lyra, his chest heaving, a breathless, exhausted smile breaking across his face. Lyra looked up at him, her storm-colored eyes wide with wonder, the heavy burdens of her past finally beginning to wash away. She was no longer just an orphan of the shadows. She was the anchor of a future king. Kalen pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her damp hair, knowing that the battles ahead would be fierce, the court would be treacherous, and the road would be difficult. But as he held her tightly in the center of the grand hall, surrounded by the astonished whispers of the world, he knew that for the first time in his life, he was truly entirely free.